Hi everyone, so I'm Louise. I'm an associate professor at CBMR's Programme for Medical Design, working with Ken Arnold, who you've just heard from. And I'm delighted to introduce Christopher E. Forth, who's the Dean's Professor of Humanities and Professor of History at the University of Kansas. So has heroically flown in via Madrid and a cold, so we're very, very pleased that you were able to talk with us this afternoon. So Chris is the author of an impressive 12 books spanning the cultural history of gender, sexuality, the body and the senses, but with a really interesting focus on fat, which is why we invited him here today. And he's published Fat, Culture and Modernity in 2014 and Fat, A Cultural History of the Stuff of Life, which is a wonderful phrase, I think, from 2019. So the science talks this morning took us inside the metabolizing body, giving myself a tongue twister there, on levels ranging from organs to microbes, molecules, and genes. Chris is going to turn our attention a little bit, following in Ken's line of thinking, to the experience of being a metabolizing body in a society. So asking how humans in different times and places have experienced, thought about, understood, and judged what fat and obesity mean to us. So with that, I'll hand over to Chris. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Louise. That was great. I really appreciate that. I think you are probably figuring out now that I have a cold that I managed to pick up in Madrid. I don't know who does that. I do that, apparently. I was very happy and clearly quite surprised to be invited to Copenhagen for this event. It was a real honor. It's also quite a challenge. I'll tell you why in just a minute. Many thanks to Louise for fielding so many questions and helping to organize this. I know that Imke, I think I've bothered her with a lot of questions and things, and I do appreciate her patience. I thank you to Ken for, I think, probably somehow being a little bit involved in this, and to Kristen for being a really able ambassador. I don't know where she is. Excellent. Thank you. So the challenge of this as a talk is that I don't really know anything about metabolism. That's kind of a little bit of a problem. In fact, this is the book that was being referred to, and this is also my shameless self-promotion. My focus in this project, which basically is a history of fat stereotyping. It is not a history of diets and dieting. It is not a history of how and why people gain weight. So I hope you can imagine why metabolism wasn't really something on my radar, because it wasn't an aim of mine at all. I did do a word search, though. I do mention it once in a footnote somewhere for some reason. Yeah. So, and also, to be frank, it may not have even occurred to me to use metabolism anyway, even if I were interested in something else. And it's mainly because the question that I would have to ask myself is, how can one apply a very modern way of understanding the body to pre-modern periods without being accused of anachronism or biological essentialism? This rumination on historical periods reminded me that one of the aims of the book was to overcome the very common misconception that stereotypes and intolerance for fat are primarily modern phenomena. They are not. Okay. Oh, yeah, thank you. Oh, yeah, oh, that even better. Yeah, thanks. And they are not. Another thing that I was trying to overcome, not because I had a need to overcome it, but because the evidence simply suggests that the history of fat stereotyping viewed over a long period of time is not primarily about women. In fact, up before the 18th century or so, I would say that most of the stereotyping, the real vitriol, was being leveled against men. Okay, and so there is a very different way of thinking about this at work here. So thinking about things in these terms, I thought it might be interesting as a way of bringing something to the table, okay, which I obviously am not able to do in any kind of strict medical terms, was to rethink some of these analyses in the context of what's sometimes called the metabolic humanities, specifically in regard to earlier periods, as you can see from the title, mostly looking at early modern Europe, but I would argue you really can't look at early modern Europe and understand it without also understanding the role of classical antiquity in all of this. So this is a very long story here. So what I'll be doing is giving a very general presentation on some things that I hope you find interesting. I certainly do find them interesting. So let's get started. Now, the sociologist and historian Hannah Landecker has done much to promote metabolism as a way of conceptualizing bodies in the modern and late modern periods. I also believe that she had been a speaker in a previous Metabolism Day. She may even be here somewhere, or maybe on YouTube, I don't know. Or maybe I'll find out later. Landecker argues that modern metabolism is a very particular concept, she says, as well as a model in which food enters the body and, in a sense, never leaves it. Because food transforms the organism's being as much as the organism transforms it. It is a model for how social things, food in particular, enter the body, are digested, and in shaping metabolism, become part of the body in time, not by building bones and tissues, but by leaving an imprint on a dynamic bodily process. Landecker also notes that knowledge of metabolism in the industrial period was framed by manufacturing and energy. Knowledge of metabolism, she writes, in the postmodern period is suffused with environmental risk, regulation, and information. Overall, then, one has the impression that Landecker views metabolism as a distinctly modern way of approaching the body, one seemingly without antecedents in earlier historical periods. This appraisal resembles those made by others, such as Becky Mansfield, when she describes related developments in epigenetics as contributing to what she calls a new model of the nature of life, in which the body is open to its environment, the body is permeable, and biological development is open and malleable, the body is plastic. Now, I'm not necessarily critiquing anything other than the periodizing of these concepts, okay? So I'm not disagreeing. I can't really disagree with what Landecker or Mansfield are saying. And of course, there's much to commend metabolism as a way of thinking about the interconnections between bodies and places, both literally as well as metaphorically. It's not at all uncommon for scholars of urban life to analyze the metabolism of cities. And environmental historians have also got considerable mileage out of the concept. Medical anthropologists have been doing some especially interesting work in this area. I'm thinking, I'm thinking in particular of Harris Solomon's book, Metabolic Living. In this fascinating ethnography of modern Indian engagement with fat and nutrition, Solomon claims that Landecker's rendering of this history provokes complex questions. How do we turn the environment into ourselves? Under what circumstances does the body twist inside out? Solomon claims that the fundamental condition of metabolic living is the fact that people reckon constantly with absorption. Now, as I was preparing for this conference, and I was reviewing literature in the area, much of which was very new to me, I was actually struck by how old some of these basic ideas struck me as. Not in terms of their specific contents, which are, of course, quite modern, but in relation to the more general claims about bodily plasticity and permeability. For example, we were told by some that by proposing that man is what he eats, the philosopher Ludwig Feuerbach summed up this emergent perspective in the 19th century. Feuerbach's famous gloss on Jakob Molschat's work reads thusly: food becomes blood, blood becomes heart and brain, food for thoughts and feelings. Human food is the foundation of human development and feeling. If you want to improve the people, give them better food instead of declamations against sin. And then, of course, comes the famous dictum that would live on as a proverb in our culture: man is what he eats. A man who enjoys only a vegetable diet is only a vegetating being, is incapable of action. For a number of people working in the metabolic humanities, this statement seems to accord well with an emerging industrial order where bodies are increasingly understood in mechanical terms, and also a model of the body that one historian famously referred to as the human motor. Okay, all of which And this certainly seems to be the case. It makes perfect sense to me. Yet one may approach these statements as also pointing backwards in time. Despite being cited as a novel approach to food and the body, Feuerbach's modern claim arguably contains decidedly pre-modern elements. The notion that food becomes blood and shapes thoughts and feelings is quite simply ancient, traceable to Galen, if not to the Hippocratic authors. Feuerbach's assertion that a vegetarian diet produces vegetating beings does actually echo 19th century British claims or accusations about Hindus who often were vegetarian, and which they interpreted as being, well, the question they asked was, how can somebody be manly and energetic on a purely rice and veggies diet? And the argument was, no, they can't possibly be. That's why the British are so manly in India. But the thing is, if we take it literally, which may not have been Feuerbach's aim here, so let's be very clear about that. The claim that eating vegetables makes one vegetate more closely resembles the laws of sympathetic magic that occupied the ancients, that recurred in the 17th century, and that continues in various ways to structure how many people perceive of food and the body even to the present. To be sure, acknowledging similarities is not the same thing as collapsing such ideas into a single continuous view of the body over time. Historian Ken Albala cautions us against an overly hasty association of these ideas with modern nutritional science. It might seem that the classical model of nutrition involved an explicit idea of food as fuel, he writes, being burned in the body and providing energy. This is, of course, the modern concept of calories. It will be anachronistic, though, to confuse our ideas of metabolism with the notion of an internal flame being constantly stoked. In fact, nutrition is far more frequently thought of as a simple replacement of the body's substance and the generation of humors and spirits. And this is true, of course. It would indeed be anachronistic to draw equations between ancient and modern approaches to what we might call metabolism. But does this mean that there are no similarities at all between them? I would suggest no. One can argue that the basic structure of metabolism as a concept, referring to ingestions, incorporations, and transformations of matter, is not particularly new. Social theorist Maurizio Meloni's historically informed query is thus a good one. If we situate ourselves at the level of the ethics or the anthropological dimension of the body-world interface, it is fair to conclude by asking, what is modern, if anything, about modern metabolism, industrial or post-industrial? Now, it's not uncommon for historians to make use of a sort of shorthand to describe bodies at various moments, which is why we sometimes refer in an overgeneralizing way to the modern body, the medieval body, the ancient body, and so on. Generalizations like these can be useful insofar as they offer ideal types that provide general insights into important developments across broad sweeps of time. The shift from a Galenic model of the body to an iatrochemical one is, of course, significant. And without this, it's unlikely that something like modern metabolism would have ever emerged as it did. If Meloni's rhetorical question encourages us to seek instances of metabolism before industrialization, the simplest way to do this might be to discuss immediate precursors to the metabolism concept itself. Ordinarily, it would be essential to explore the work of the physiologist Santorio, whose experiments in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, where he was weighing himself before and after meals, contributed to his reputation as a founding father of metabolic studies. This would reinforce the idea that metabolism is a distinctly modern development, and I think there's some value in this. But I'm not going to be doing that today, because everyone does that. My approach to exploring what I'm calling pre-industrial metabolism is not going to go down that path that I just mentioned, which would be kind of talking about Santorio's work, as important as it is. Nevertheless, it's not what I really want to do. Maurizio Meloni, again, has been quite outspoken on the need to look beyond things like this. He says that what we today call metabolism can be seen as the whole ethical problem of the humoralist body. The continuing ingestion of matter from the surrounding world, the turning of food into the four humors, the digestion or concoction and transformation of it into semen, with all the possible metabolic effects on generation, heredity, and race, seen as dependent on the exposure to certain food, climate, and experience. And as Maloney continues, if we expand our understanding of metabolism to include certain ethics of living, the careful handling of the porosity of life, the anxious perception of how bodies are absorbed into places or food shapes our health and mood, and the number of individual and collective techniques required to manage this vulnerability, it is doubtful that we have moved very much away from the concern of a Galen, a Vitruvius, or an Ibn Sina, or we mostly in the West know him as Avicenna. It's in this sense that I would like to explore the in very general terms, the notion of kind of pre-industrial metabolism, with specific reference to cases of fat in early modern Europe. Before I can do that, though, it's worth reminding ourselves of the ancient sources of these ideas. I should begin by noting that the Greeks recognized that bodies could grow fat for a variety of reasons, and I'm not going to be exploring all of them because there's no time for that. And in various ways, they more or less anticipated some of our modern claims. A very common assumption was almost common sense to us, eating too much without exercise. I mean, this is what basically how the Greeks were viewing excess flesh, polysarkia, which is the term that they used. Yet since the days of the Hippocratic authors who were writing around the 5th century BCE, environment has been viewed as exercising a major impact on the relative weight and size of the body, as well as the moral character of peoples. In the book Airs, Waters, Places, the Hippocratics contended that in general you will find assimilated to the nature of the land both the physique and characteristics of the inhabitants. It was with such environmental and climatic premises in mind that the Greeks judged the Scythians, that ancient nomadic people of Central Eurasia. Residing in a cold, moist, and windy environment for much of the year, the Scythians did not experience dramatic seasonal variations that would require them to develop endurance. Due to their environment, Scythians of both sexes tended to be, and this is a quote from Hippocrates, gross, fleshy, showing no joints, moist, and flabby. Because of their fat and the smoothness of their flesh, their physiques are similar, that is, between males and females. The Hippocratics maintained that people typically residing in what they called fat, moist lands were more likely to have similar features in their bodies and characters. This cluster of qualities was freighted with moral significance. For where the land is rich, soft, and well-watered, there the inhabitants are fleshy, ill-articulated, moist, lazy, and generally cowardly in character. This more or less geomorphic perspective facilitated a mesh of mutually supporting qualities within which fatness was entangled with understanding physical with physical and cognitive traits. In some respects, the Scythians provided a template for understanding physical variations among different peoples of the world. Actually, you see by the late 18th century, the Chinese being described with explicit reference to the Scythians. Okay, so this provides a kind of a model for dealing with non-Western peoples. Hence, throughout the 18th century, the much-fabled fat Englishman was seen as an effect of the cold and moist climate of the British Isles. The same was said of the Netherlands, which is how some tried to account for Rubens's predilection for depicting fleshy female bodies. Rather than reflecting an early modern celebration of fatness, then Rubens's work was seen quite often as an effect of the Dutch climate on bodies and his own personal preferences. If you actually read what Rubens is writing about fat, he actually invokes Sparta and says that we need to follow the Spartans. Too many people in our present day, he writes, are fat. And so it's kind of hard to square that with some of our very common assumptions about what Rubens was on about. None of these claims would have made much sense if they were not framed with a distinctive view of the body traceable to classical antiquity. The Greeks often viewed the body in terms of 4 fluids or humors that were present in all people. The number of these humors, I think, became consolidated at 4 with the work of Galen. With Hippocrates' work, you see a number of different numbers given for how many humors there are. Typically, though, we understand this in terms of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. As you can see from this schematic, each humor corresponded to certain qualities that were, at least in the earliest texts, associated with the 4 seasons, and that carried with it certain characterological traits. The proportion of humors within a given person differed, with each individual having a particular humoral makeup or complexion in which one humor tended to predominate. Health was considered to be an effect of achieving an equilibrium of the humors to prevent one from dominating the person. So as refined and systematized by the 2nd century physician Galen, humoral medicine included attention to what early modern doctors would later call the 6 things non-natural, or the non-naturals. That is, aspects of health relating to the manner in which one lived rather than the innate qualities of the body. That would be the naturals, I suppose. This was specifically in relation to air quality, food and drink, exercise and rest, sleep and waking, excretions and retentions, where that worked in relation to the digestive as well as the reproductive systems, and finally the passions of the soul, as they called it, but we would typically understood in terms of emotional well-being. By attending to the non-naturals, one could pursue a regimen or diet in which decisions on what to eat or how much to exercise would ideally be based on one's unique humoral makeup. Humoralism defined Western medicine and remained the dominant way of understanding weight loss and weight gain until the rise of modern chemistry in the 17th and 18th centuries, though actually vestiges of humoralism would persist into the early 20th century in various forms. And actually you can see some so-called alternative health practices out there that also invoke the humors, partly because there's a passing resemblance between the Greco-Roman humors and the doshas in Ayurvedic medicine in India. I think it's one reason why people feel then authorized in drawing upon both. As we saw in relation to the Scythians, pre-industrial bodies were understood to be porous and plastic in relation to their environments. A person whose complexion was marked by the predominance of phlegm. This is the typical way in which fatness was understood. These people tended to be naturally colder, moister, and thicker, and therefore more prone to corpulence. As humoral complexion affected temperament as well, the phlegmatic person was said to be typically lazier, paler, and colder than others. Partly as an effect of their accumulated fat, the phlegmatic were also said to be cognitively thick, if not stupid, as well as cowardly. As such, the phlegmatic person would be expected to eat less, exercise more, sleep less, select the right foods, and try to be less happy. And yeah, the passions of the soul did contribute to weight loss, because one of the common claims made about the phlegmatic is that they're very cheerful, and it was almost as if anger was understood as heat, and that being angry, or at least not being happy, was considered to be a way of burning off fat. And this recommendation that one way of losing weight is by pretty much changing your emotional state as much as possible, this persists through the early modern period. And actually, I think you can find examples of it today as well. It's not exactly gone away. Being cold and moist, phlegmatics were also encouraged to maximize foods that were considered to be hot and dry, such as chicken, egg, onions, garlic, bitter gourd, fenugreek, and grapes, and a whole series of other things. And so once again, eating these foods that were also considered to be conducive or to contributing or to building up certain humors was all considered to be part of the way in which the body would essentially metabolize these and bring about different responses in the body itself. As a further indication of the role of the environment in weight gain and loss, I would like to linger over the odd relationship between the body and the land itself. This is one of the things I found most fascinating in this project, and some of the examples I'll be giving today are things that I wish I had more time to research in greater depth. But unfortunately, after 11 years, I have this attention deficit problem, and I'm looking at other things besides fat at this point. After all, fatness was considered to be a quality of soil. One sign of fertile soil was its capacity to retain its shape when squeezed between one's fingers. You see this in Virgil's book, the Georgics, and you see repetitions of it in other ancient as well as medieval farming texts, many of which built upon the classical heritage. This intrinsic greasiness of fat soil was also due to the presence of lipids, which they wouldn't have recognized at the time, obviously. Some of which would have been traced to the manure used to fatten fields. Fat land was therefore linked to the fattening of bodies, indirectly as well as directly. The Greeks and Romans contended that very fertile soil could actually contribute to corpulence, partly because people did not need to work hard in order to obtain a sizable yield. In one form or another, this belief would endure for more than 2,000 years. From the Greek historian Herodotus in the 5th century BCE to the political theorist Montesquieu in the 18th, it was agreed that fat soil produced physically and morally flabby people. Weak, effeminate, cowardly. Not just because they had more to eat, but because they didn't need vigorous effort to eat their fill. Essentially, to go back to what I was saying earlier, they're too happy. Things are too easy for them. And this is the happiness and ease. These are two of the factors that would contribute to weight gain. But fat land could promote corpulence in more direct ways, specifically through the inhalation of vapors arising from the soil that were themselves considered to be fat and therefore potentially fattening. This could also be done by drinking water from rivers whose shores were lined with fertile or fat soil. Geographers knew that rainfall and melted snow in the mountains, for example, could carry away some of the fatness of soil, of fertile land, thus producing rivers whose water would also be considered to be fat. Sometimes this worked in reverse, with fat water fattening the soil. Observing that soft water contained fat and oily particles, in 1650, the German geographer Bernard Waren claimed that the Seine in France was a river blessed with fat and soft waters that rendered the land fertile as well. Fat land thus generated fat air and fat water that could literally fatten its inhabitants, a phenomenon that was often observed outside of Europe as well. Writing in the 3rd century of the Common Era, Aelian, I'm almost done, recorded Egyptian claims that the sweet water of the Nile River had the ability to make a person grow fat due to its capacity to help build up a mass of flesh. After 2,000 years of lore about the almost magical powers of the Nile, by the early modern era, many European geographers and travelers were well acquainted with the remarkable fecundity of the soil that lined its banks. This led some travelers to corroborate ancient claims that simply drinking the water of the Nile caused ordinary Egyptians to grow fat, despite the heat and their otherwise frugal diets. So rich and fat was the soil around the Nile that, according to Pierre Daviti in 1637, the locals had to thin it out. And this is the language that they're using. Up until the early 19th century, modern soil chemistry wipes all this stuff away. But the notion that that fields are fat and they're actually analogous to women's wombs, this is ancient, definitely medieval, and it's still operative up until around 1800 or so. Greasy fatness that seemed to be about everywhere in Egypt, in the land, the air, the water, as well as in bodies. No wonder some people thought it would definitely be on the minds of its inhabitants. It is perhaps only a matter of time before traditional wisdom about the cognitive thickness of fat people would be applied to countries where the land seemed to be overly fertile, as if enjoying the bounty of the earth necessarily rendered one soft in mind as well as body. A fat soil produceth a fat understanding, notes John Arbuthnot in a rather obvious play on an ancient proverb that's traceable to Galen. I'm going to actually jump over the last example and just kind of get to the end. I've tried to provide here a very general overview of select cases of body-world interactions that, while not at all identical to our modern notion of metabolism, nevertheless provide compelling evidence for a long history of medical views of the body as permeable and plastic. While undoubtedly important, one could argue that modern metabolism does not amount to a new model of the nature of life in which the body is open to its environment and biological development is open and malleable. In fact, I think that this may have always been a feature of Western biomedicine. To quote and end with with Maurizio Melloni once more, then, and speaking here only as an historian, maybe we should not be dazzled by the apparent novelty of today's theory of plasticity. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. And I'll take chair's privilege by asking the first question. So I think you gave us a wonderful demonstration of how history can help us understand the present we find ourselves in and where our ideas come from, and maybe how thinking through present ideas like metabolism can help us reimagine history yet again. And one of the things that really struck me was the tenacity of these stereotypes and stigmas. And as we know today, that's very harmful, both ethically and indeed medically. So how do you think we might use history here to help us combat kind of stigma and stereotyping today?
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the things that I've found, and as historians, we're discouraged from doing this, that is noting continuities over long periods of time, because then we're accused of anachronism, and I understand that, and I agree with that mostly. But at the same time, I think if we look at the history of fat stereotyping, it's a history of a willful repetition of past ideas, particularly from the Greeks and Romans, very much filtered through certain notions of definitely gender, race, as well as a kind of version of class as well, and that this repetition has tended to serve to reinforce the notion that fatness is a kind of sign of femininity, which in the case of women is not necessarily a problem historically, but in the case of male bodies, this femininity is considered to be at odds with obviously what a proper man is supposed to be. And so I think that by bringing in the fact that historically we have done this, repackaged, reimagined things from antiquity, quite unbeknownst to us and quite unwittingly, obviously, I think that perhaps by drawing attention to that, maybe it'd be possible to start thinking about new things, instead of constantly retracing and repeating the past.
And maybe by being shocked about the past, we can maybe be a bit more critical of our own assumptions. Yeah, thanks, Chris. Kristen.
Thank you so much for that really great lecture. I'm going to ask again, I feel really bad for doing this because I'm probably the only other historian in the room, but I wanted to ask a question about history and about science, because I think I arrived here at the center, like many other historians, with a very constructivist kind of approach to the past, and we can never be anachronistic. We can never say what we think now is what they thought before. But being here amongst all these scientists here in the basic research center who study, as they would say, the biological basis of life, and think in evolutionary terms. Why is it that we're so scared to think about biology in the way that we do history? I guess, why is it such a terrible thing? I think especially when what I see you've done here is a really elegant talk from a scientific starting point.
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question. I think a lot of what I do is gender and sexuality. It's very much a part of what I've been doing for a long time. And I think that feminist critiques of science are one of the reasons why, because there's just ample evidence of biomedical, psychiatric notions of female bodies and minds that have historically done little more really than to find ways of, I'm not saying these were the aims of it, but they ended up resulting in marginalization, discrimination, the creation of hierarchies that disempowered girls and women for centuries. And so I do, in a lot of ways, understand what you might see as a certain feminist reservation when it comes to science, because very often the reflex is to critique, which I agree with. Critiquing is great. But as a number of people have pointed out, particularly in relation to the so-called new materialism that's become theoretically important in many feminist theory circles, there is a value in taking science a bit more seriously and maybe finding ways of moving beyond mere critique. I think critique is very important, but we've done it for decades, you know, and so a number of people who are actually, looking at the Mind the Gut, there's an interesting book called Gut Feminism that's out there by an author who is trying to do exactly that, to actually construct a more productive dialogue with science and medicine, rather than just getting into the knee-jerk position of kind of expecting the worst. Okay, I personally think that there are ways around that, and I think that's one reason why some of us have. And I was like this for the longest time, too. I'm not, immune to this. To what one scholar has called a knee-jerk constructivism, the idea that whenever our tendency is to mistrust almost all medical claims about the body, which I find problematic when the person who tells me that also has to leave class early because they have to get to the doctor. So I find it a little bit odd there. But I don't know if that kind of gets towards your question, but that's what I think. Yeah.
Any final questions? Yeah, last one from Ken.
Thank you so much, Chris. I thought that was fascinating. I was really struck by the number of historical examples you gave where appearance and body shape, physiology and body processes, the landscape even, the psychological character bit, they all seem to come together. That sense in which, fat is fat is fat is fat everywhere you look. And I wonder whether, grasping at something else that might have changed in this kind of picture of continuity that you're helping us to realize, is the disentangling of all of that something that's genuinely different? So are we now much more attuned to thinking, there are causal links between them, but people who study the psychological side of it are going to come up with rather different conclusions to people who are studying the internal processes, and they are going to have a very different perspective, those who are interested in where these people live. So that we've ended up untangling the layers, and many of the examples you give seem to bring them all together.
Yeah, they do, and they did, and I wonder if it's partly an effect of specialization, where now there's many different aspects of a person can be approached by different specialists with their own expertise, and I think that this has definitely fragmented what I see as what had been a kind of, not exactly unity, but certainly a cluster of concerns that kind of hung together in a loose way, but in a kind of systematic way as well. And so that's one way I think about that. But however, though, I have to say that when looking at stereotyping and fat phobia and disgust about fat, it's surprising and also disappointing to me to see how often these things, regardless of the breaking down into specialization, they still get lumped together. They still kind of end up cohering in odd ways, it seems to me, okay? And I say that with a lot of concern about drawing too many continuities, but I just see them. I just see them there a lot.
Thank you. So we're going to thank Chris and move on to the break and make sure everyone to be back by 3:45 for the next talk here.